Hi, everyone. We're back. I'm doing back-to-back episodes. I don't know if they'll go up back-to-back. They might. I might just do it. We're joined. Last time we were joined by Fred. Hopefully, people enjoyed that episode. It was another transatlantic episode. But now we're heading back to the somewhere in the Pacific Northwest, and we're talking to Elliott, and we're going to continue our series on the weird right. Elliott, how are you doing? Pretty good?
Oh, I'm doing great. I just recovered from a headache today, so thank God.
Nothing feels better than the absence of pain.
I mean, really, it does.
And that's actually a little bit of some real philosophy there. Cool.
Looking at
So
you, Sam Harris.
yeah. Well, I keep looking through this telescope at the sun to see if God's there, but I'm just blind now. So it's a real problem. I think
Well,
this
I'm sure you could see a teapot flying around though
yeah,
now.
the theists are wrong because I'm blind now. Yeah.
It's almost like the theists specifically covered that point.
Exactly. It's almost like, the transcendence of, it's almost like monotheism solved this problem fucking thousands of years ago, but whatever. Nobody listens to the chosen people. Okay, fine. Cool. Well, today we're gonna get back into it. And since it's been quite a week for me, and Elliott, you seem a little bit more chomping at the bit than I'm gonna let you do the intro if that works. Does that work? Are you okay
Yeah,
with
that
this?
totally works. Well,
Okay.
especially because it was, and again, like it's funny because I don't know if we appear prepared for these shows or whatever, but if we
I
do,
don't
then
know.
hilarious, right? Because literally this topic that we're going to talk about today was something that came to me like literally yesterday.
In a dream?
It was no, not in a dream. As I
Oh,
was like, might as well be though.
might
As
as
I was
well.
like driving to like driving in between like Yakima and stuff to help plow some snow and on the side. But basically, basically, what I was there's okay. So the topic here is how again how the Enlightenment screwed everything up, right? And in particular, how the Enlightenment screwed up our sense of time and space through measurement. I was reading something that said a little while ago that general relativity could not have occurred to many ancient peoples because the notion of time being a separate thing, like a spatial dimension, the notion of space being a spatial dimension that could be flexed, or dilated, it literally would not have. You have to have a kind of Enlightenment frame of reference in order to even have this thought to begin with. So, this is a Kantian notion, right? That
Yes.
our perception of time and space, mentally speaking, shapes the realities that are possible for us to perceive, not just in terms of like, a scientific notion, but also in terms of literally how we perceive reality. And I think that's really critical when we notice some atheism plus type science people going, well, what do you mean God will deal with you or the divine will deal with you? This is just cosmic pride because you are but a speck of dust, right, in the
Right.
grand scope of the universe.
Which, by the
And
way, that sentiment is expressed in both Jewish and Christian scriptures. That's a profoundly Judeo-Christian idea that you are but a speck of dust, which is it's interesting to me that they always go back to this. I'm like, oh, so you mean like the Psalms? I mean, like, where do you think this idea comes from?
well, Job is really the best
Job?
example
I
of
mean,
this, where God literally says it, right?
yeah, exactly. Well, yeah,
But
anyhow,
yeah,
as a side note,
no, for sure.
it's always interesting to me. I mean, I keep going back to Moldbug. It's like it's interesting to me how Christian atheism is. It's a heretical form of Christianity. It's really interesting.
Well,
But yeah,
certainly the Western version of
oh,
atheism,
particularly the Western version.
absolutely.
Yeah, yeah,
Right.
absolutely.
Because if you look at the Greek atheism, because there was Greek atheism, they have a whole different, I mean, again, like atheism as a philosophy, you can passively not believe in God, but that's not a philosophy, right?
Right.
That is just a random belief set that you have, and it's totally potentially reasonable to, in a box, think that some people could not believe in God per se. But the thing is that uh, to say that you're an atheist with respect to this particular God is parasitic on the notion of God. And I know that Dawkins people and everything want to go after that, but this leads us back to the issue of like what Kant was dealing with, and the early Enlightenment thinkers, right? And before we were talking, so okay, sorry. So part of the intro is that atheists will frequently say that, and then people will get this sense of despair of like, well, I feel like I'm so tiny, and then I say, well, hold on now. If you're going to compare yourself to the entire universe, then you really ought to also consider the scale of a subatomic particle, right? And in that case, you are basically also a universe, right? So which is it? And I say, look, both of these perspectives are fundamentally stupid, because you as an object are you, right? To try to look at yourself through the lens of the universe or from a particle are both simultaneously dumb. You are one unit. You are one, right? And to try to put your unit system outside of yourself is really the thing I want to talk about today, because I think that is the first step, or one of the first steps, one of the many steps where the Enlightenment started to erode our sense of placement in the universe, both in terms of material reality, but also in terms of spiritual reality too.
Well, yeah, and if you learn one thing from this episode, is that you, viewer, you're a unit. You're a total unit. Unit. Yeah, feel good about that. Everyone needs a little pep talk. You're a unit. Yeah, you despite your many diverse members, right? Both, however you want to define members, whether that's innards or just your components of yourself, you are also you, right? You are you're a self-relating self. Kierkegaard would say you're a self that relates to yourself, and therefore you exist. It's not just Cartesian, cognito ergo sum. It's that you exist because you can see that you exist, and you experience that, and you experience the world around you. So you're a unit. Feel good about that. Be a human. It's okay.
And this is kind of this was the insight that I had, which isn't a super crazy insight, but it was like, wait a minute, one of the things that transitioned us from pre-Enlightenment to Enlightenment is standardization of units. And I went and did a quick Google search, and indeed, almost all unit standardization programs, not any specific ones, because SI came later, and there was standardization before this, in some way or another.
Just to clarify, both for myself and for the viewers, because some of us are humanities types and not in your realm. Exactly. By units, you're talking specifically about units of measure, right?
Well, distance, right. Okay.
Length,
yes.
Distance, weight. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. And actually, so I'll scale back for a second, because that's a fair point. Because it's not totally obvious, like even among science, what a unit is. So I like to say that, this kind of comes back to, from a math perspective, of which I am one, so I can speak most confidently about this.
You are a math. Elliott, everyone, we need to be very, Elliott, we're so proud that you finally feel brave enough to come out as a math. And math and math self will now explain to us what that means.
Yeah,
your truth. You're going to speak your truth. Okay,
I'm having trouble keeping track. Otherkin, right? Math, otherkin. There you go.
Yeah.
But essentially, here's the deal, right? Is that when people learn about stuff like imaginary numbers for the first time, which is the square root of -1, very quickly defined, they say that seems like a pretty fake number. And I'm like, okay, fair enough. You're in a long history of people calling numbers random mean names. The Pythagoreans famously, mythologically drowned a guy for saying square root of 2 was a number. The Greeks and Romans generally hated negative numbers for a long time, and everybody's happy with negative numbers nowadays. It's kind of like, look, all of these numbers, right, that we have are just ways for us to describe different concepts around quantity, but every number is fake except for one. Let me be very clear. There is no 2 of anything outside of your opinion of what stuff is. And the reason being is I say, look, show me 2 things, right? And they'll say, oh, I have this plate and I have that plate. And I'm like, well, but they're clearly not the same plate. right? So you have one plate and one plate. There is no two plates. And they say, what? And I'm like, yeah, because your notion of calling these two clearly not the same item is you imposing a pattern upon, or noticing and abstracting a pattern from those two objects, either way, right way or left way, and coming up with that category having two items in it.
And this actually, weirdly enough, I did not. It's cool when this happened because, again, to the dear viewers probably noticed that me and Elliot don't always really plan. We just kind of roll and just kind of see where the thought takes us. This is cool when you see these connections sort of organically happen, because this. I'm going to let you keep going, but I just want to say that this actually touches on something that I think I have done one of my episodes with Mitch, our good friend Mitch, who's a linguist, who's also on the show sometimes. This is semiotics right here. This is getting to the notion of semiotics. So I guess you could say, sort of semiotically, there can be two plates, but not mathematically. Maybe, is that what you're saying? Like or not, maybe not mathematically. Maybe what we're really getting to here is that, as different as math and language are, because they are different, and I always hate it when people are like, math is a kind of language, and my response is always, shut the fuck up. No, it's not. It's actually not. But I think what people mean by that, right? You had your high school teacher tell you that, right? To make you feel better about doing trigonometry or some shit. I think what they meant to say was both math and human language abstract outwards, perhaps, in order to make sense of the world. And I think that is something, again, another area where our two worlds, yours and mine, kind of interact somewhat, or perhaps have some contact.
No, absolutely. And I would say that we're probably both talking about semiotics, right? But
it's all semiotics. But
right,
hint,
exactly.
Hint, it's all, Jonathan Pajot, who I enjoy, says it's all symbolic. I would say it's all semiotic, but I think ultimately we mean the same thing. Yes. Yeah.
Right. And so kind of, to address your point within there is, like, what I'm saying is that essentially what you've done when you talk about two or three of an item is you have defined what math people would call an equivalence class. So you have started out with a criteria of saying two things are the same, right? I begin with equality, which means that something is the same if it is literally the same. And that's an identity, right? So when you hear trig identity, when you hear, oh, this is my identity, think about those things. What is the thing that is not duplicatable, right? Exactly.
I identify as a map. Yeah.
So okay. So that's why two is fake, right? A much beloved number, completely fake in reality, because there is only one of each item. If there was a copy of that item, it would share all quantities, and one of the quantities it would share is position in space-time, which would mean that one is the only thing.
You mean like atomic position? Yeah.
Yes. Right.
Which, as we all know from the philosophical film Time Cop, cannot happen.
Exactly, right.
Anyone know that scene I'm talking about? Okay, yeah, it cannot happen. Okay, we're dealing with high-level philosophy like Time Cop, so just like deal with it. Okay, yeah, no.
Well, as above, so below, as the occultist would say. But anyway, so point being is that, like, look, if you're going to start saying that numbers are fake, I'm going to say they're all fake except for one. And to kind of continue on this point, I say, hey, show me half of this piece of chalk. Right, this is the kind of the more killer version of this, in my opinion, right? And they'll say, oh, okay, and they'll break the chalk in half, and I'm like, oh, where's your half of chalk? You have two pieces of chalk now. And they're like, what? And I'm like, yeah, dude, 1/2 is way faker than 2 even, right? Because 2, I can at least create a category. 1/2 is describing an abstract property of the item, which is a length.
And this
right?
is,
so I'm
yeah, sorry. I'm just gonna riff and do my you're doing your math stuff, and I'm doing my humanities stuff. This is not the same thing, but it gets at the same kind of issue as sort of the ship of Theseus, right? Like, how many parts can you replace before it's no longer the original thing, right? And I think this is you're cutting to that problem there, that philosophical issue of, like, what what distinguishes one thing, or what, or in a more complex level, one person from another person, right? But even like pieces of chalk, right? Yeah. Or
Right.
or two halves of the same worm, or something like that, right? Like
Right.
what point does it become different? So
And with chalk, I say, and if I'm depending on the philosophical point I'm making, because firstly, there's we're talking, when you mean one half of something, you're talking about dividing by two an abstract property of that item, right? And or if I want to get to this other, which is a sort of essential categorical point, I say, hey, show me half of a plate, right? And in principle, they would break the plate in half. And I'm like, where did the plate go? You only have two shards of glass. It's no longer a plate. And this gets to an ancient Aristotelian notion of like, sometimes when we talk of a thing, that thing no longer becomes the thing if it can no longer do the task it was purposed for, right? Or that, essentially that once if you glued the plate together, it would be a plate again, right? So it's to point out to people that, look, objects don't really, and Jordan Peterson makes this point, and it's sort of a postmodern point a little bit, but postmoderns go way too far with it, I think.
don't tell him.
Objects.
Don't tell him it's postmodern, because he'll have to sit down and talk to you about it and discover that he was postmodern all along. If anyone has watched his discussion with Slavoj Žižek, you're like, motherfucker, this was you all along, but it's fine.
Okay. No, and that's the thing, is because anyway, the point being is that he's not a critical theorist, right? He's not a Marxist, but there's plenty of room for right-wing postmodernism. Anyway, point being is that objects really do not exist outside of the person perceiving them. I'm not saying molecules and atoms don't exist. The moon is there even if we don't look at it, but it's not the moon as we understand it. It might just be a random light source, right? Because our notion of the moon also involves like the month, right? Which is a timekeeping. So for us, the moon is bound with time.
And I will point out, as somebody who studies Germanic linguistics, that the word month has the word moon inside it.
It's literally right there. It's not even complicated.
That is not just me making a quick point. That's an actual etymological truth. This is very clearly, every Germanic language, the word for month has the word moon inside it. So,
which is, by the way, and so to kind of steal some of your turf for a second. Go ahead.
That's true for many languages around the world. Actually, for most languages around the world. So, just by the way, not just Germanic.
Sort of right. So,
I don't want to say it's universal, but it's pretty widespread. So, yeah.
So while we could say that probably for many animals, the moon is the thing that vanishes in the sky, right? For humans, it is literally a timekeeping thing. Right. Yep. In addition to the bright lesser sun, as it's oftentimes thought of. But regardless, point being is that to steal some of your turf very briefly, this is why. So in the Enlightenment, there was one person who was really enthusiastically took this charge was Hegel. Right, and then other people like Webster took up the mantle later. There was this notion.
Hegel. You've said his. We've said it twice, not thrice, because if it say it thrice, he'll appear, and we won't be able to get rid of him. So
exactly. Well, we'll just have to.
If you say his name a third time, there's going to be a synthesis, and it's going to be a problem. So let's not. Yeah.
I've recently learned that the thesis, antithesis, synthesis, that was Kant.
It's more Kantian than it is Hegel, but yeah.
Right. Yeah. The Hegelian notion is much more
it's cyclical upwards. Yeah, it's a whole other thing.
Well, it's typical, but it's like thesis, negation, and then abstraction, negation, concrete. So when lefties talk about we need concrete blah blah, they mean the thing that unifies a thing and its opposite explicitly. Very fascinating. But okay, so point being, to steal your notion, is that in the Mark Twain literally said, I don't give a damn about a man who can't spell a word more than one way. back in the 1700s, the founding fathers would have had spelling bees, but it would have been how many different ways can you spell a word while
Yes.
it retaining its original essence, right? So there was this
Yes.
playful notion, but with the Enlightenment, there became this notion that we have to hyper standardize words and meanings through dictionaries, which is why I never look at the dictionary. I only look at the etymology, because the dictionaries have been purposefully scrubbed over the years. And if you look at the etymologies, a lot of constellations of words suddenly just make total sense, like month.
Yeah, month, moon, the word. Yeah, so yeah. Anyhow, if people are wondering, so like Old English monath, which is the word for month, and then yeah, when you hear monath, month, it sounds almost exactly the same. It's because because month comes from the old word for moon. Anyhow, but ultimately this is not a linguistics episode, but yes, the connections there. No, I think that's a much better way. Of course, I'm incredibly biased because I love older versions of languages and studying historical linguistics. So of course, I mean, I'm all about etymologies, but yeah, no, an etymological organization of words in your brain just makes more sense than an alphabetical thing.
Yes.
Obviously it's a lot easier and handier, right, to look up things alphabetically speaking, but it's not how quote actual language unquote whatever that really means works. If we can, to use another abstraction, actual language quote unquote doesn't work like a dictionary, right? It works like connections of words to each other. And just as a side note, when I'm not busy doing this show, I teach foreign languages. And one of the first things you have to get into, and anyone who's studied a foreign language will like really studied, like spent some time at it. The thing you really have to like break out of, if you've only ever spoken one language your whole life, is that words in actual language are not organized like a dictionary. That's an artificial, very Enlightenment, and I'm not against dictionaries, but it's a very artificial way of viewing words and their connections to one another, because actual language is like bubbles in your brain and they intersect. They're like Venn diagrams. It's very complex. That's how actual language works. And I think that the reason, aside from just chiming in from my camp, the reason I bring this up is I think it gets to this notion of like, before the episode we were talking about, like, there's this standardization of units that you get sort of more in a math sense, but simultaneously, because the Enlightenment was a large project that cut across multiple different, fields, you also get this sort of standardization of language thing going on. And they're not exactly the same, but they have an ideological base. It's the same, which is we can measure, quantify, classify everything using science, and then the world, all problems will be solved, and we will be able to completely be in control of our world, and all these lies that are not true. Which is, by the way, I don't think me or Elliott are really saying, we're not against any of, like, by themselves, right? I think studying language, of course, is something I do, and you, of course, study math. But I think what we're really critiquing here is sort of the Enlightenment hubris, maybe, of like, and by knowing everything, which by the way is impossible, by knowing everything, we will then be able to perfectly order the universe sort of in our own image, which, as we've established on this show, goes against what the Logos actually does, right? The Logos organizes the universe, and we experience the Logos and maybe make sense of it. At least that's my take on it. Again,
in a certain way, it's literally satanic, right? Because if you have the story of Satan, right, a classic anyway story of Satan is that one of the reasons why he fell from grace from God was because he wanted to rule on his own, right? Or because he thought he could do it better than God, or he was smart enough to.
I take, as I always do, I take a more I mean, I'm not denying that there's something there to be said. I take a very Tolkienian aspect of or a view on this, and one that is best epitomized by the character of Saruman, right?
You're right.
Saruman versus Gandalf, right? Because in many ways they're almost the same, but they're also very different. And this was done totally on purpose by Tolkien, right? They're both aspects in some ways of the god Odin. Anyhow, topic for another day. But the point being that Saruman, why is Saruman bad? Because Saruman seeks to understand, not to understand. He seeks to understand in order to instrumentalize everything. He will
Yes.
not let things be themselves. So when Saruman really turns and breaks bad, what happens to his cloak? It becomes rainbow colored
Of
because
many
a
colors.
prism splits light up into its constituent parts, but does not recombine it. And so there is that's a really important point. And if nobody knows what I'm talking about, what the hell are you doing? Go read Lord of the Rings. But it's an important point because, right,
I mean,
Saruman.
go read it, because this doesn't come up in the movies.
No, yeah, you have to like read it. This is in the book, but it's an important point because Saruman breaks apart what he cannot put back together, and I mean, in more ways than one, right? He breaks apart whole sections of Mirkwood. He breaks apart the natural world. He doesn't seek to understand in order to marvel in awe of Eru Ilúvatar's creation. And for those who don't know, who have not read the Silmarillion, Eru Ilúvatar is essentially God, right, for the world from Tolkien's mythos. He does not seek
Actually,
to
there's a couple of very easy CGB Grey videos, a total of 10 minutes, which breaks down Eru Ilúvatar and the One Ring.
Yeah.
So it's like, who is Gandalf? What is the One Ring? Go watch those. You'll totally get everything.
Yeah. Anyhow, you don't have to read. I do recommend the Silmarillion, but yeah, no. But the point is that right, like, why is Saruman bad? Well, he doesn't start bad. How does he become bad? It's because he wants to know, but he doesn't want to know in order to revel kind of in creation, which I would agree with Tolkien is a holy thing. He wants to know in order to view what was whole as its constituent parts. And the problem is, as you talked about breaking a plate earlier.
Mm-hmm.
When you break something, you can attempt to put it back together, but you kind of can't. It doesn't work. That's not how that's not how time works. It's just like things break and then they are broken. And barring some sort of transcendent thing, you can't put it back together. So I guess that I guess what I'm trying to say is, in some ways, Saruman embodies this idea of, if we can just measure everything, we can control everything. And maybe that's not totally false in the sense of, well, maybe you could control everything. But if anyone's read through Lord of the Rings, Saruman is not happy controlling Isengard in the way that he does. It does not provide fulfillment for him. It leads to his, he just despairs. He just falls further into despair because he's not experiencing objects as whole. He's experiencing them in their constituent parts. Anyhow, ultimately, this is not a Tolkien episode, but it always comes back to that. And since we've done Tolkien episodes before, I'm tying it back into that. But I do think the point holds. So anyhow, continue, Elliott. Sorry, autistic rant at least temporarily paused.
No, and I think actually that's, again, like a really great framing of the key insight, because within the Lord of the Rings, one of the key thing, and I think actually the Lord of the Rings is totally on topic for this episode anyway, and most of our episodes, because it is a response to the Enlightenment. It's not necessarily a particular, but the Enlightenment as mechanization. So Isaac Newton was part of the Enlightenment, I think, right? I don't think it's reasonable to try to separate him out. However, he's a totally different wing of the Enlightenment.
Yeah, he's doing his own thing.
Which I think is better known amongst occult circles and less better known amongst statecraft circles. But people don't really know that Isaac Newton, the vast majority of his work was theology, and then angelology, occultism.
Yeah, Newton is one of these weird. Sorry to interrupt, but it's just Newton is one of these weird kind of I would say Christian alchemist, something like that.
Yes.
That is perhaps
genuinely Christian, genuinely
Christian alchemist. He's using alchemical methods to prove the Bible. Now, you can cringe at that. You can say, wow, that's interesting. Regardless of reaction to it, I think that's a pretty accurate explanation of what Newton was trying to do. He's trying to find, on a language note, this is maybe more of, again, you can see what I tend to be interested in. He was trying to look at the alignment of words and letters in the Bible in order to find a deeper hidden code, which is, I mean, essentially Kabbalistic, right? Like he's
yes, that's literally Kabbalistic.
yeah, but he's doing it in a very radical Protestant way. Yeah, he's a very interesting figure, and I'm really happy you brought him up because yeah, in sort of the history, but also the historiography, to pull out some very hoity-toity words, Newton is seen as this like hyper rationalist,
the hermeneutics.
He's the hermeneutics. Yeah, he's the way that people view, at least this is my take on it. This is something I've seen. People talk about new atheists talk about Newton as if he was a new atheist. I'm like, motherfuckers, not read his journal. Like, this dude is seeing the divine absolutely everywhere, particularly in his scientific / alchemical, since they were not different at this time in history. They were kind of the same thing, experiments. Right. He's seeing it's all connected in this tree of being. This is a very supernatural view of the world. But yeah, we this is an one of many anachronisms, right? We look at the past, new atheists look at the past and read themselves onto the past, and I'm just like, yeah, but that wasn't what people, definitely not what Newton. I mean, maybe there were some hardcore atheists back in the day. I mean, I'm not going to say there weren't, but
there certainly was.
Newton clearly wasn't one of those people. Like
no, and he's not even like
his science was. His science was a way of worshiping God. Like this is a very profoundly religious mindset that he has. And I'm not critiquing it. I think it's actually kind of brilliant and beautiful in some ways. But again, yet another autistic rant, apologies. But it's something that I'm really happy you bring it up, because nobody talks about that aspect of Newton and his life, but it's so crucial to understanding his experiments even, right? Because you have to know whether, objective spiritual reality aside, whatever your religious and or spiritual beliefs are or not, you need to know where the thinker is coming from in order to really understand what they mean by anything. And if you lose that on Newton, you've kind of lost Newton. So anyhow.
Well, and that's exactly on topic with kind of part of the thrust of what I'm saying is, like, I think a lot of, especially like Christians, have a difficult time realizing that we have been, well, they probably also don't realize the actual biblical history of this too, so fair enough on them, but they don't understand that we have been, quote unquote, old priest, new priested, right? So King Darius of Persia pulled this move, which is classic in the ancient era, very literally 1984 move, where you shuffle around all the people to, quote unquote, restore them to their ancient religious heritage, right? So it's sort of a reinterpreting the past in the way that's convenient for the ruler in this moment. And this is very similar to what happened to all of these Enlightenment thinkers is I think the new atheists want to position everybody who was part of the Enlightenment, but still a part of the old system, not quite, a Kantian or not quite a Hegelian or whatever, right? They want to categorize everybody else as proto-atheists. Oh, they were just one half step away from atheism. And gosh, if they had been born 10 years later, they'd be a full atheist. And it's
do you know what's really cringe? Sorry, this is an aside, but it connects 100%. So what's really cringe, I've witnessed this at an unnamed but very well respected academic conference. I have witnessed people, well respected but unnamed scholars in their field, attempt. I heard this claimed, and I almost threw a chair. I almost did a St. Nicholas. It's almost St. Nicholas's Day. I almost punched a heretic in the face. I don't advocate violence though, so I didn't. I heard somebody claim that if C.S. Lewis had lived 10 more years, he would have become an atheist, and I almost went nuts.
Wow.
Yeah. So my only point is, why do I share this aside from, Colin almost had random outburst? I share it because this is a relatively modern or postmodern, perhaps, however you want to classify Lewis, thinker. And they're even attempting to do it for Lewis. So yeah, if they're going to attempt to rewrite Lewis as a proto-atheist, of course they're going to attempt to totally classify anybody such as Newton as a proto-atheist. Sorry, that's just an aside, but it's an illustrative point to, like, this is my overarching point is this is an agenda that is being literally crammed, and it comes from the university, folks. I've been there. I've seen it. I know how the sausage is made.
And it began in the university.
It began in the
this
university.
it was something. It's a university, and it's interesting, I guess, when we say that when folks say that the left colonized the university, and it's like not really, because all of this stuff started in the university.
I think they call it. I'm more in the colonization camp, but that's a topic for another day. Yeah.
No. I'm just throwing that out there as like as an edgy counterpoint, right? To yours and my narrative, right? Because our narrative is that they colonized, or at least the one I think we both share, is that they colonized the university. But it's kind of like, well, but in a certain give unto Caesar what is Caesar's, right? The universities were never really any good for God-fearing Christians.
In the words of the poet philosopher Kanye West, I just love information. So please throw it out there, Elliott.
Oh goodness Lord!
Yeah.
Yay is short for yeet, I think.
should I have shown up with a full-on mask and randomly quoting from the Bible at random bits? Hey, but you know what? Randomly quoting from the Bible at random bits is actually a Newtonian thing to do. I wonder what the code says here at this verse in this chapter. Maybe it's applicable. So in some ways, maybe Ye is channeling a bit of Newton. I don't know. Anyhow, topic for another day.
Who knows, right?
Who knows what he's doing? Anyhow, but yeah, no, this is an agenda that regardless of whether it originates from the university or is colonized, ultimately, in some ways, it doesn't even matter because it's what is. And if you're anybody who is sort of anti-current thing, as we very much are here, yeah, it's a problem. And again, what that thing I said about C.S. Lewis, that was real. I mean, I didn't hear about that. I witnessed that. That was something it was part of a academic presentation, and everyone sat back and just nodded their heads. And I thought, you are all supposed to be Lewis experts. I mean, these people know more about Lewis than I do. And I'm like, but you're wrong. Like, that's objectively false. Like, that is, yeah. And do you want to know, sorry, it's such an interesting story. Do you want to know what their sort of their justification was? Well, Lewis called into question the historicity of the book of Job. And I was like, oh
my God.
Bro, like, the historicity of whole sections of the Bible, that doesn't, whether you would hold to that or not, it doesn't change whether you believe that God is real and that Jesus was the Son of God. Anyhow, it's like that doesn't. Anyhow,
and the whole notion, I think that Job, and we've talked again, and this is, well, okay, this is totally still on topic.
Yeah.
The Enlightenment people they basically want to kill mythical history, right?
For sure. Mythic
and
time
the thing
is
that mythic time is it's either all literal history or it's all not history.
Mythic time is ancient time, and as if we've learned anything from me and from mine and Elliott's very autistic rantings, is that the left hates the past, and the more farther back you go into past, the more into mythic time you get. So of course you're going to attack the most old mythic stuff because it's bad. Well,
the more stable you get, the more stability you get, the further back you get, because
the more base you get.
Because the thing is, it gives you increasing clarity in the future.
Right.
Like Jordan Peterson said this, and I think it's a great way of thinking about it, is that like in the short term, the closer you get to, and this is like a physics notion to, not really like in a philosophical sense, but it's like if you think about yourself as a point, right, and there's all the events that led up to you as like a cone behind you, and then there's a cone ahead of you as all the different futures that could happen with your action, the closer you get to you right now in your body, the less free will you have, the more constrained by the immediate past you are and your immediate options of the future. But the farther out you look, the more free will you have, because you have the ability to in micro increments, change the future through your micro things. Now, of course, there's plenty of people that could agree or disagree, but it's just
my Lutheranism is bristling at this notion of free will, but I'll let it continue because I like you as a friend.
Exactly. So regardless, so getting back to this point here, which is that, okay, so here's the punchline in my opinion, right? Which is that given everything we've said, it used to be back in the day, pre-Enlightenment, that everything was measured either in terms of literal human proportions or based off of things that we could actually personally with our bodies see, right? So 1 hour is literally 1/12 of the day, or 1/4 of a phase of the sun or moon rising or falling. And you can very easily tell those sort of hours within a decent tolerance with your naked eye, so to speak, right? You can personally observe this. It's concrete, it's not abstract to you, right? Same thing with like a cubit. And it's sort of interesting to think through have you ever, since our measurement system exists in objects outside of our body, right? So it's an object that we picked, that we stacked one on top of each other to get a measurement system, right? Since that's outside of our body, we can't feel the size of things around us, because we've been kind of robbed of that way of viewing the world, right? Like, when if you were to say a pinch of salt back in the day, and you're like, oh, I pinched the salt because you're using kosher salt, not like table salt. If you say that, there's a good chance that your fingers will kind of feel that, and so I think that the Enlightenment measures moved from a subjective human-centric unit to an objective object-centric unit. The old names were kept, but the meanings of the names were changed.
No, I think that follows. And if I may, there is a strong analog also during, that really comes into flower during the Enlightenment, let's say, that has to do with language. And I don't necessarily even mean the more scientific study of language and how languages connect, because that is a later Enlightenment thing that I actually think was pretty cool. Obviously, I'm biased. I love historical linguistics, but I'm thinking particularly of the standardization of languages. So like, the reason why you can look, if you speak English, which if you're watching this channel, I'm assuming you do, you can look at a piece of written English and you'll note that our spelling system is batshit and makes no sense. Yes, but it is so standardized that despite its insanity, and despite some regional variations, yes, I know, between like, UK and English or something like that, or UK and English, tells you how I feel about
exactly.
it. American, real American
English,
and whatever they speak over there. UK English and like American English versus Canadian English, right? You do versus like South African, Australian. Yes, there's some distinct, slight differences. But it's not like we don't spell anything any more coherently in America. And there's real historical reasons for why the spelling system is batshit. But despite its batshitness, you can look at it and read it, assuming you know and you've learned how. Why is that? Because at some point in time, and it didn't, over a period of time, the language, at least the written language, was standardized. And this is, I think the story of the standardization of language, in this case, I'll say English, but really the standardization of any language, I think for me, mirrors the Enlightenment in a few ways, if you'll permit me, Elliott. It obviously comes out of the Enlightenment. Not that people hadn't attempted it before, but the mass adoption comes out of the Enlightenment. And that's also partially a technological thing because of printing press. Yes. But why are more and more people learning to read and write? Well, this is also sort of an Enlightenment project, right? So it's all, there's levels of connection here. So historically speaking, right, standard language is an Enlightenment idea for sure. But also the process of standardization of language, what it does to language, at least to written language. Let's stick with words on a page because the spoken language is always messier. It's even to this day, right? It's messier. It's also more fun, but it's messier. So the standardization of written language, and let's just, again, this holds true for most languages, but let's stick with English just because I'm assuming that our audience is Anglophone and speaks English. There's a trade-off that happens when you standardize any language, in this case, English, written English. And I think the trade-off is the trade-off that happened when English was standardized is also the trade-off that happened when the Anglophone world experienced the Enlightenment, is that you get kind of good and bad things happening simultaneously. So then there's a lot of analogs here. So if you'll just permit me, this I do believe this idea holds. So like when you standardize a language, all of a sudden you can read, as long as you learn this one way of spelling, right? You can read shit, regardless of where the person is from, as long as they speak the language. They don't even have to be native speakers. They just have to have learned it well enough in order to write it well enough. All of a sudden, people can read. This is great. This is actually kind of amazing because it allows the transmission for the transmission of ideas that hitherto might have been really difficult, right? Because believe it or not, it's as hard for Americans and Canadians. But if you go to England, well, to the British Isles in general, the distinction between varieties of English can get quite extreme. Now, believe it or not, kids, before like the 1700s, people kind of wrote, yes, there was this sort of how inventive can I spell things, sort of a Thomas Jefferson style thing, but also it was just like people in Northumbria, people in Scotland, people in Wessex or western part of England, people in the eastern part of England, people in Wales, if you're speaking English in Wales, they would just kind of write how they spoke. And so like anybody, if any of you have been forced to read the Canterbury Tales or something like that in Middle English in high school or something, or college, you'll see this, that, oh, like there was no standard spelling.
You essentially have to try to read it out loud to yourself.
You have to read it aloud. And in some ways, that's amazing because the connection between what's spoken and what's on the page is closer in some respects. It preserves more of the original. That's nice. What's hard about that? Well, you essentially have to relearn the spelling every time you read a new author. And if you're a hyper nerd like me who does medieval studies or classical studies, anything like that, if you're reading languages in their older form, you're struck by this, oh my gosh, I can't believe this so-and-so author's spelling system. It makes no sense. And you have to take 20 pages before you figure out what they mean. So that's a problem. So you're more true to what's being spoken, but the problem is it doesn't allow for transmission of ideas over time or place as well. That is a downside. Okay, flip side, standardized language. It's great. I can read somebody writing I can read Harry Potter, and I'm in America. And even though Rowling might spell color a little differently, I don't care. And maybe I have to look up what snogging means because I'm not a fucking Brit. All the love to Fred. That's a minor inconvenience. I can read this story about a boy wizard who lived in England, and it's fine. Why is that why can we do that? Because of standardized language. Okay, that's great. What's the downside? Well, right, I can sit and read Harry Potter aloud, and I'm going to sound like a West Coast American. That's probably not how J.K. Rowling would have read it aloud. So there's a give and a take is what I'm trying to say with standardization of language. This is an Enlightenment project, and I do think there's also a give and a take with the Enlightenment. As I've said, in the most recent episode I put up talking to Fred about liberalism, which is comes out of the Enlightenment. I don't think it's all bad, but I do think there was a give and a take, and I think we did definitely lose something with sort of having undergone the Enlightenment. And I do think that the analogy to the standardization of language also holds. We lose something of the regional individualized flavor because there is this, as you pointed out, Elliott, this mechanization of thought that leads to the mechanization of society. It also led to the mechanization of language. Anyhow, I think that's the easiest way I can end that rant, but it is an important point. And so what I'm trying to say is the Enlightenment affected a lot of things, including at least written language, but also spoken language, but particularly the way we write today. So if you read and write standard English today, you are a product of the Enlightenment just because of that alone. Just the way you write. And it's a give and take.
Absolutely. And I think that's exactly on par with what essentially, you can see this both linguistically and in terms of units of measure, right? And it happens, and again, I looked it up, it happens at exactly the same time. And I'm not saying it was
contemporaneous.
a freaking conspiracy, right?
No,
what I am saying though is that there was indeed some increasingly I sound a little bit communist around this, but we have Uncle Ted as a potential predecessor that we could fall back upon, so we don't have to be communist. But there's this mechanization of the universe where where some biblical
That's not,
scholars.
by the way, that's not only a communist idea. That's just one of many. They took it and ran with it for sure, but lots of people have been we're talking about that. So
No,
you're not a
absolutely.
commie
It's
for
just
pointing that out, Elliot, is what I'm trying to say.
no, precisely, right.
Yeah.
So the point being is that the mechanism, there is this notion of the machine becoming the fundamental. So how about this? What is the fundamental unit of analysis of the universe, right? It used to be the anima, right, or the soul, I believe is the way to think about that, right? And the soul, what is the soul? It's the thing that animates, right? Well, what is a machine, right? It's actually machina, right? If you look at the etymology of the term deus ex machina, it's God out of the machine. Well, what's the machine? It's a crane, right? Originally, right? So and I think that's a totally reasonable metaphor, is that as opposed to machina, ex deus, right, which is machines from God or something, if that's how that works. I don't speak other languages. We have,
we're talking
nowadays,
Latin, by the way. This is Latin, folks. Yeah, Latin.
Right.
Yeah.
So instead of machina ex deus, we have deus ex machina, and I think that's the best way of putting the Enlightenment, right? Is that all of a sudden
your grammar's a little
mechanize...
off, but I know your point. Yeah, the teacher in me wants to correct your Latin, but I'm not going to. I'm not going to be the Roman centurion in Life of Brian. I will resist.
Right. No. This
You've
is why
got to conjugate it. You can't just
freaking declensions, bro. Yeah, it's probably machinus or machini or whatever, ex dea.
I'd have to actually double check the declension table. But yeah, my Latin is rusty. Apologies. I read it. I don't really write it. So yeah, just bear with me.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So we have this interesting notion, right, where, and this is, by the way, if you've been paying attention to the cybernetics stuff, you will think, aha, this actually is like where we go from thinking about cybernetic systems as soul-based systems to cybernetic systems being machine-based, because essentially instead of over-indexing on spirit, right, so to speak, with anima, saying that there is a spirit of blah, they would instead say there is a mechanistic thing giving rise to a phenomena that previously would have been interpreted as a spirit, including you, Mr. Human. So it's it's this imposition of external ways of viewing the universe, right? And the commie people talk about the subject and the object a bunch. I don't find it very helpful, because it's just unclear what they're even talking about.
It's very Hegelian.
Yeah, exactly. So I would say, look, think about it like this: is like our language becomes standardized, or our units become standardized, right? And our units, instead of being human based, so literally based off of your proportions, you instead become measured by the objects. Instead of you measuring the objects with your body, the objects measure you instead.
Yes. in Enlightenment world, objects measure you. Yeah. Which is true. There's another strong analog here with language. So the standardization of language is really, it's a double-edged sword, as I've said, because what it also leads to, and this is I'm also gonna have to make some apologies here. I'm not trying to sound super lefty. What I'm about to say might sound hyper woke, but I don't mean it in a woke way. When you get the standardization of language, let's focus specifically on English here, because again, I'm assuming that we have mostly monolingual Anglophone peeps here, but this holds true for any language that has standardized. This just happens. Many examples across different languages. When you standardize a language, you essentially artificially privilege one variety over another, or you do a hodgepodge artificial standard. So the hodgepodge artificial standard is essentially a conlang. It's a language that never existed before that you just fucking create. And this is why some people have snarkily said that standard German is a conlang, and I would actually agree with that. That's a kind of a contentious point, but yeah, standard German is fake, but people speak it, so it's real. But like in English,
pay close attention, by the way, to the word artificial, and compare with artisan, right? Like in your own time, like you really do see this transition from an artisan as somebody who makes something to basically a worker, you know, in a like literally the whole communist notion of the working class
Yeah,
would not have
but my
made
point,
sense because it would have
yes,
been the artisanal class. Sorry,
yeah,
sorry,
yes,
sorry. I
yeah,
don't
but
mean
the point
the
is not
autistic
finished.
in a different
Yeah, yeah,
direction.
yes.
But yeah, go ahead, go ahead.
So Twitter brain versus Substack brain. Okay, I have that's the intro. Now let me make my point.
Exactly.
I can't do the quick thing. I have that was the paragraph intro. Okay. So so you do get either an artificial variety that never really existed before, but I guess it's real now. And that happened, like, for example, in German. Or you get like well, we're going to privilege the X variety over the Y variety of the language. Now, sometimes that X versus Y, you know, what gets to be the standard version of any language, oftentimes it does have to do with sort of naturally occurring power centers. So maybe some of it is somewhat justified. But at the same time, look at the history of England. There was the standard variety of English for the long period of time. Well, I don't even want to say standard. The prestige variety of English was what the king spoke. That kind of makes sense in a monarchical system, right? Makes perfect sense. But it's not like the king hated on other people. It's not like people who say, oh, I speak the king's English. But it's not like people in other parts of England weren't well respected for speaking the way they speak. But when you get standardization in this very Enlightenment sense, it's no longer this is what the king speaks. When we're in the presence of the king, we'll talk like him. Oh, no, no, no. Now it's like, this is what we speak, and therefore you are wrong, and we must go into your small hamlets and exterminate your varieties of English. This sounds extreme, but it's actually what happened. And it's part of the reason there are still various dialects that are you know, doing well in England or the British Isles today, but many varieties have been pushed down. Okay, maybe that's a little bit more away from us as North Americans, but in America, if somebody walks up to you speaking just with the thickest Appalachian English, they are looked at very differently than somebody who speaks like they're from California. And I don't mean this in a hyper lefty woke sense. I just mean that, like, they could be the most base motherfuckers. And in my experience, people from Appalachia are incredibly based, but they're seen as stupid. When in reality, in many respects, Appalachian English is actually closer to older English varieties brought over from England. But nobody cares about that because we've sort of decided as a nation that this flat sort of American affectless speech is what's standard. Anyhow, so, and what I'm saying is this is other examples of the cost, the linguistic cost of standardization, which is a result of the Enlightenment. And that cost, I think, is very similar to the cost that you're describing in the more mathematical world. Perhaps
this exactly lines up, because I was going to bring up this point explicitly to say no, it's not just your body in terms of a cubit, which is roughly the length between your fingertip and your elbow, right, and other measures of length, right, or, you know, the hours of the day being roughly about sunrise, sunset, and all this stuff, right. It's also has to do with basing our shared notion of measurement through, and this wasn't always the case, right? But frequently it was the case that the unit system lived and died with the current reigning monarch, right? So the king literally was the thing that gave proportion to society and about which society revolved, almost like, you know, the sun. And so, you know, there's a notion in which, like, the richness that ancients perhaps would have, and ancients, like in our tradition, I don't know about Romans and shit, but basically, like, you know, the pharaohs and other sort of centralized king situations as well. All of these people, like, would have thought, oh, it's a foot, and this is based off of the king who is given to us by God to rule over, you know, or maybe they hate the king, maybe they think, oh, this is a punishment from God. But regardless, point being is that the language being the king's speech, right? That's why it's Queen's English, by the way, and the measurement system being given by the king.
The Queen's or the only reason we say the Queen's English is because up until recently we had a queen. by the way.
Yeah, but I hate the current monarch. He's a bastard.
Oh, yeah.
Freaking
Well, sorry.
Weffel.
But England hasn't been a monarchy at least since Queen Anne. So there you
That's
go.
true. That's true. Yeah. No hot take there. That's a cold take, but yes,
That's
indeed.
Moldbug. Moldbug has established this. This is pretty standard. Yeah.
Yeah. So essentially, the king, again, a human person that you could in principle see and touch, being the standard bearer, the human attainable standard. But notice what we do instead, it's an objective standard, right? A rule of law as opposed to a rule of man, right? An objective standard by which, everything gets applied, and you can, instead of saying you're in the king's favor, out of the king's favor, or the king needing to respect different real political movements, you could say, oh no, given the objective standard, you are falling short or not falling short, right? And this is where the wokes want to kind of colonize objective standard space and be the arbiters of what is a correct objective standard and what is not, by both destroying standardization on one side and also imposing more standardization on the other side.
Yeah. They're all the standardization is dead, long live the standardization. Yeah, they just want their own kind. They're
precisely
not, yeah.
So that being said, another little quippy thing I have here is that the Earth began to revolve around the sun when humans recentered their units on the universe rather than themselves, right? And then all measurement units used to be defined by proportions of the human body or directly by human experienceable objects. And then the Enlightenment, literally, we threw ourselves out of proportion, right? The proportions used to be human-centric, and then by objectifying ourselves, we bequeathed the universe with the power over us, as opposed to us having the power of the universe, which is this whole notion of like morality being necessarily being a system that tells you what to do, as opposed to the law passed down by God for humans specifically, right? This isn't like
also,
God.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. Oh no, I was about to say just that God started us out with, hey, enjoy, just don't eat this fruit. And then we ate the fruit, which was the Enlightenment, the knowledge of everything good to evil, right? We've talked about that a little bit.
The Enlightenment is an example of this fallen tendency, which has existed even before the Enlightenment, to be fair.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yes.
To be
very precise about it, right? So we have this the rules start very simple, and then we break the simple rules, and then they get increasingly more complicated as we get more sophisticated, and find new and strange ways to break the rules even more.
Because as anyone who does any sort of basic law, anything, they'll tell you, like any legal theory that's worth its salt will say, the only reason laws exist is because people have already committed those crimes. And the only reason you have to say don't do the thing is because somebody's already done the thing. Like, right? So this notion of increasing laws is because it's like increasing depravity.
Actually, that's right. And the whole notion of civil law, right? And not in terms of civil versus criminal, but civil in big French, European, versus common law, right? Common law is yet another example. Is common versus civil. Of civil law has this kind of notion, and actually it starts with the Byzantines. But anyway, civil law has this notion that like law could float above humans, and we could, in an abstract, detached world, find out what the perfect law would be through a kind of semi-mathematical, Rawlsian notion, figure out what the law ought to be, not worrying about humans, as opposed to, hey, laws are about to are all about how do we reduce conflicts between humans in particular, or cybernetic entities in general, but real existing things, not fake abstract things, right?
Well, yeah,
go ahead. No, that's fine. Yeah.
Sorry, as a Lutheran, this is not just me as a Lutheran, but like Lutheran ethics is very much the latter than the former. Which is also why I don't think, as much as the Tradcast might level this against us, I don't think Luther started the drag school story hour. I think that's retarded to say that, literally. Because
it was the Jesuits, obviously.
It's because it's the Jesuits. You can quote us. Because Luther
That's the real
it's yeah.
double letter questioning situations. That's the
Yes,
real situation there.
that's a half joke. It's a half joke. I've met some very nice Jesuits in my day, but I'm always wary around them because of just
They
genetic
choose to be
memory.
Jesuits.
What's
They
that?
choose to be Jesuits.
They
It
yeah,
is it
yeah.
is literally not a hate crime.
No, but it's interesting because in a Lutheran, particularly Lutheran ethical framework, the sort of the law, capital L, right, 10 Commandments, does not exist, right, to make you better, right? Because you can't in a Lutheran framework, right? You can't earn your way to heaven. In a Lutheran framework, the law exists to keep you from screwing up your fellow humans. And
Which
even
is
so,
very Moses based.
but
Hello.
even the even though you shall have no other gods before you, that thing, even that's in a Lutheran framework, is actually just designed to keep you from being horrible monsters who think that you're God. So so that's actually, it's interesting, like, because this very like based on actual humans, not abstract view of the law, that's actually like, again, to combine our worlds a little bit more, that's actually like, that's a very Lutheran understanding of what both religious and civil law, or let's say spiritual and temporal law, is supposed to be. It's not designed to make you a better person in this like very Enlightenment Hegelian I will improve myself sense. It's designed to be like, don't do bad things to people. That's really like what it is. It's very much centered on actual lived human experience. So I know I'm glossing over a lot of nuance there, but really, like, that's the cornerstone of Lutheran ethics. And it also jives perfectly with this critique of the Enlightenment here. And just yet another reason why I really don't think, again, we can throw Luther under the bus maybe for some things, but not for the Enlightenment. Please, not for the Enlightenment. He would have hated it. He did hate it as it was starting up, even in his day. He put people like that in a hole. He put them in holes, black holes, and let them just live in holes, and they died down there. Anyhow, interesting guy. But my point is only ultimately that right, like this more grounded view of what laws are versus what they ought to be is shared. Yeah, it definitely is shared between our two traditions, I guess, is what I'm ultimately trying to say.
Right, because I think that, because when you think, and this actually gets to the really important pivot within the Enlightenment. One of the large projects of Enlightenment was a huge rebranding of the academy, and its role in the universe. Somebody said, and I can't remember where I got it exactly. I mean, and I think you already know this one too, which is to say that somebody pointed out that used to be that the queen of sciences was theology, which, by the way, why Newton was a theologist, right? All other scientists, so all other quote, sciences, all other studies or philosophies fed into a better theology. And so around Newton's time, he did not do physics, right? He talked about aphysics, right? And he did use the word physics, right? But he did not do physics as a scientific discipline. He did natural philosophy, right? And so nature was explicitly in it, and so this notion of science actually, like, it's not totally Marxist, but people who are Marxoids really took it and ran. And so if you're a lover of science, just maybe double check and see if you're actually a lover of natural philosophy and not of this explicitly lefty notion of science, right? Like,
and it is explicitly lefty, not just in its genealogy, but also sort of per se, because it destroys the natural hierarchy. It destroys. It says, correct, we don't care about that, and we're gonna just do, I don't know, something crazy like virology, and we have no natural hierarchy, and I don't know, maybe we'll just do whatever we want with virology, and maybe that will happen. It's about as much as I'm going to say on this platform about that. But yeah, we don't have any other, we're not beholden to anything except our field. We care about our field, and it's that there's no other broader hierarchy, and we just don't care, and there's no consequences.
Right. We would like, and again, this is part of the act. That attitude right there is part of the act of eating of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, right?
Yeah.
That's part of that, right?
No, this is a consequence, and yet another consequence of the fall, which, you know,
Correct.
by the way, we all share it. By the way, ain't nobody innocent in that. So be measured with your judgment of the people, but definitely judge their frameworks. Yeah, judge the hell
Their
out
programs
of
for sure.
the frameworks you should judge, not the people, but the frameworks you should. Yeah, because it's a bad framework, because it doesn't play into the broader tree of being, or the tree of sciences, or whatever you want to call it, right? Like however you want to conceptualize that. Is you're not holding the highest good in the highest good, you're holding a lesser good as the highest good, and you're gonna have, to quote South Park, you're gonna have a bad time. You're gonna have a bad time. So,
and I'm not quite sure what Newton would have, how he would have thought about the term law when he, is using his laws of motion. I'm not even honestly, I cannot remember off the top of my head if he called them the laws of motion, right? And even if he did,
expert, so you'd probably, somebody can look it up.
Regardless, it's a fun research topic for everybody. Essentially, the question is, what would Newton have thought the word law to mean? Because we tend to think about the law as like something that there's it's sort of the rule of law, as opposed to, and this is where Newton might be a little bit mechanistic, versus and this gets into the cosmology that I personally adopt, which is a sort of capital L libertine notion, and I'm very extreme on this. I'm essentially panpsychic, which is to say that since I am so
what's your flag colors?
Yeah, exactly, right. since I am so anti-determinism, I say no, nothing is determined. It's just that some things choose to follow these laws. That's my take, anyway. And so I'm not quite sure if Newton sees it in that sense, or if he sees it in that they must follow the laws, and there's no other way.
I would hold to the latter, but of course I'm very biased in this, because I tend to see. I think you and I would probably look at Newton very similarly, but also through very shaded lenses of, I think you would probably see him as a natural philosopher first and a Christian second, and I would be the inverse of that. So I would seem to, I really get a sense, not being a huge expert on Newton, but I get the sense from him that like he is doing this stuff to experience God.
Well, I think that
our difference to experience God and ultimately worship God, because to experience God in an authentic way is to worship Him. So that's
our difference. That's
what I see a lot of it. So
right, I think our difference is slightly more subtle in that, like, I think that you see him as an Orthodox Christian. I see him as a.
I don't see him as an Orthodox Christian.
Probably.
I don't think. He's definitely not Orthodox. But I can look at his motivations and go, I don't think he is not a John Dee, right? He's not trying to communicate with angels and then do polyamory because the angel told him to, or some shit, whatever John Dee was doing. Newton is not that kind of
he's a very correct. I think that's fair. And I think that, any honest person, Christian or the atheist, does, I think, the most interesting person to struggle with, to be an Israelite about, is to consider Newton, right? Who is deeply, deeply occultist, but also deeply, deeply Christian, right?
Like, by the way, just for everyone and for the YouTubes, by Israelite we mean in the etymological sense of Israel, to wrestle with God. Anyhow, yes,
exactly, right.
By the way, we mean it in the actual etymological sense. So no, I think he's just wrestling with God in his way that was pretty common actually for the time period, and as long
as he came to the right conclusions, would not have been seen as too terribly horrific.
It wasn't seen as woo-woo as we would probably see, as sort of maybe American evangelical Christians would see it today. It was actually more kind of in the water in that time period, in that place. So it was Now, that doesn't necessarily make it right or wrong. That's a sort of a big, that you decide. But that, like, he was more in the mainstream, or at least closer to the mainstream than you would probably think. So,
Well,
yeah.
and this whole notion of what Newton is doing, that whole idea that is woo, that's an Enlightenment notion, right? Because what you
woo-woo.
have done is you have fully separated the spiritual and temporal realms, and you are saying, oh, Newton is mixing those two realms, and it's like, bruh, like, do you even like Christ, bro? Do you even like essentially Christian do? And this is where the Enlightenment gets really insidious in certain ways, right? One of my favorite
It's very
hymns
Gnostic.
has well, it is very Gnostic
It's
too.
very
One
Gnostic.
of my favorite hymns has a line in it. I give thanks to God for soul and body strangely joined, right? And it's a beautiful line. It's it's titled, a great hymn is that I had 1,000 tongues, or that I had 1,000 voices to sing the praise of God, essentially. And that's one of it, is like,
is that a Wesley?
Thanks to you. It might be a Wesley.
Might be a Wesley.
It's
Feels Wesley.
If it's not Wesley, it's the other guy.
Well said.
There's like,
yeah,
there's like two dudes that
if
had
it's,
all the
if it's
1800s bangers.
I'm gonna make it. I'm gonna make a statement here, because this is the place to make it. If it's not a mighty fortress, it's not a real hymn. Anyhow, this is how autistically I am. But
What's
yeah,
up?
no,
I would agree.
It's a joke. It's a joke. I love Methodist hymns, but I can't sing along because they jump registers and I can't sing. So I'm like, whatever. I'll let the other people sing. No, that's, I think, yeah, this is that, and what Lewis would call, to bring back Lewis, the amphibious nature of humans, right? We're in and out of spirit, right? We're in and out of water. We're in and out of the spirit. We're spiritual and physical, and that this is the union of that is something that's sort of at the core of being a human, and from at least a small Orthodox Christian perspective, is at the core of being a Christian too. That you to separate those two too drastically, you fall into the Gnostic problem. So yeah. Well, I think, again, I'd love to keep going, but I think we're probably like other people I want to make these somewhat listenable, so we'll probably have to keep coming. We should do a whole episode just on Newton. I think that's that would be sort of
Pretty
Newton
cool.
as an example of perhaps an Enlightenment thinker who ran contrary to the Enlightenment in some key ways, who maybe was doing his own kind of anti-Enlightenment perhaps thing, or his own just side project that just really kind of was maybe not quantifiable. Maybe he was never Enlightenment to start with. I think that would be an interesting thing to get into. So
Brilliant.
yeah. Quick things. Well, I'll let you plug stuff first. Anything, it's okay if you don't, but I'll just give you the floor first since you're the guest. Anything to plug before we send people off into the weekend? Anything?
No, as usual, nothing to plug, except for if you are an academic type, right? I would plug this. If you are an academic type, I think it's actually very important to go figure out how you can do some blue collar work for a couple days. This is
what kind of work? Sorry, I couldn't quite hear.
Oh, blue collar work.
Oh, blue collar work. Yes.
Whether it be volunteering or anything,
Yes.
because here's the
100%.
thing, and it's not even
totally
like in
agree
a
with this.
Thoreauian romanticization, right? Because obviously there's a lot to living that lifestyle that comes with whatever the heck, right? But it's really important, because getting out there and doing something with your hands and then seeing the result afterwards is quite satisfying. And you'll find nature and just the getting out of the ivory tower for a bit, for a walk in a token notion, will refresh your brain and give you amazing insights all over the place.
Oh yeah. I working part-time in a restaurant has completely, it's not glamorous, but man, does it reduce the level of pretension. And anyone who watches the show knows that that's a temptation. It's Lewis's temptation of the inner circle, and nothing breaks you out of the inner circle like having to scour a pot.
And again, you get some pretty fantastic insights from scouring pots. Exactly.
You do.
This is why
you actually learn a lot. And when you scour a pot, it's a repetitive action, and you can, if you are still, inclined to be of the academic type, some of my best academic thoughts, I have a whole ideas for episodes while scouring pots, and I quickly text them to Elliott and we plan them. You know, because it allows you to you know, it's like, I think what was Einstein, right, had his greatest revelations like riding his bike and stuff like that. There's something about
Right.
this. Yeah, right.
Of course, he was dropping hella current day acid at the time, but regardless,
That's true. Granted, but you know what I mean. Yeah, no, that's a good
point being is
recommendation.
that, like, so I think part of their
do
thrust
real
is
work.
down with the universities, up with monasteries, right? Like,
I'm not touching that one. You're tempting me here. I'm not touching that one. No, but that's a good recommendation just in general. Yeah, go do something. And it does not have to be for monetary gain. Volunteer, build a garden, even just rake the leaves in your yard if you have a yard. Do something outside, or just with your hands, build something, make something, cook something. Cooking is a very hands-on, literally hands-on kind of thing. Do something like that.
It's easier than ever for us to be totally abstracted with the real world, but the real world is the greatest source of inspiration for all thinkers of all time. And in particular, if you're right wing and feel that we are losing our groundedness with the universe, well, by golly, you know, the best way to be regrounded is to go touch grass.
Go be based.
Right.
Go touch grass. Yeah, do the things. Yeah, for real.
So that's my plug, is
that's
going
a good
outside.
plug. Hey man, that's I like this new, that's a broad plug. I like that. Yeah. Let's see. Oh, you know, I recently on Carpe Forum, which is so Mitch, Wyatt, and Fred and Marshall, who've all been on the show, all write for carpeforum.com. And I've been writing for them as well. And I recently turned Elliott and my recent episode on the Time War into a blog article. And it's very it has GIFs, and it's you know, if you've watched the episode, it's pretty much the same, but I've condensed it down, and it's very snarky, and it's been well received. So I'll link to that in the description if anyone's interested. Yeah, so, and if anyone's coming here to this show from Carpe Forum, hello. I've also been sort of cross-posting. It's the cross-pollination of good ideas. I've been posting our episodes on carpeforum.com as well. So I've said it twice. I'll say it one more time. Carpeforum.com. Check it out. I'll put a link.
Look at me being a contributor to a blog.
What's that?
That's hilarious. I said, look at me being a contributor to a
you did a contributor to a blog. Yeah.
I don't contribute to.
Give me some credit. I cited my source. I cited your name, your first name only, to keep you as anonymous as possible. But I cite my sources. I do my due diligence. Yeah, so maybe check that out. If you're interested, you can follow me on Twitter at altphilologe. I know, German word. I'll type it into chat if you're interested. Mostly it's just autistic rants about Tolkien and Kierkegaard and things. But sometimes, you know, I post pictures of degeneracy in the Pacific Northwest and snarkiness. So if you're interested, it's there. Anyhow, I think that's pretty much it. I wish everyone a very wonderful Advent season. We've entered the Advent season for the Christians, at least the Western Christians. If you're an Eastern Christian, welcome. You're waiting still. You're beginning the Advent fast, I think, soon. So have a great fast time. For us in the West, have a great Advent season as well. And I definitely think we'll be back before Christmas time with more episodes. But I just, you know, it's a time to enter into looking for light in the darkness, and that is an important thing as well. There is the light shines in the darkness, but the darkness has not overcome it. And I think that this is an important thing. Regardless of whether you're Christian or not, if you're anywhere on the right, I think that idea can mean something for you, and probably does for you. So I'll leave it with that. Cool. All right. Thanks, everyone. Have a great weekend. Thank you again, Elliott, for coming back on. It's been a wonderful to have you. We'll have you back on shortly. Cool, everyone. Take it easy. Peace.